afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. We're here today, Brookson Legal, to discuss the IR35 changes that will impact you from April 2024. My name's Marcus Kenny. I head up the end hire division for Brookson Legal, and I've got my colleague Lauren Belfield.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Lauren Belfield. I'm a solicitor here at Brookson Legal Services, responsible for our IR35 service lines. We're here today to talk about the changes that are going to be happening in April to the IR35 legislation and how they impact you as an end hirer, market maker, agency, contractor in the supply chain utilising of payroll working. So some of the things we're going to talk about is the recent consultation that has taken place in relation to these changes to IR35, what the changes are going to be, so the consultation, the legislation that's taken place and what that means for you. And then we've put an example together in terms of how the offsetting rules will impact a real life scenario of what the liability reduction would be for an independent contractor that you could have. And then we'll talk about how Brookson Legal have been working with businesses and undertaking mock investigations for what it would be like if you were investigated by HMRC. So as mentioned earlier last year, there was consultation that was issued to the public around the changes that they were looking to bring in this year. The purpose of the consultation was to seek the views of businesses around the proposed liability in the supply chain. Currently, what happens is if HMRC deem that a business has not demonstrated reasonable care and has not undertaken or come to the correct determinations for the use of contractors, HMRC are able to issue a liability bill to that end hirer for the full tax and national insurance that should have been paid on an engagement. And that does then have an element of double taxation, because HMRC would have recovered taxes from the limited company, the PSC, when they've been doing the annual accounts, and then also recovered that from end hirers as well during an inquiry where they've concluded that there is a liability bill. So the consultation and the proposed legislation that's coming into effect was to look at ways in which HMRC would be able to offset the amount of tax a PSC has paid against the amount of tax that they would look to charge an end hirer in the event of that bill. So there was lots of response to that consultation, and they then announced at the end of last year that they were going to go ahead with bringing these changes in place, which was a huge welcome development in the industry. And we've received draft legislation in January of this year. No surprises there. It looks exactly the same as what the proposals were during the consultation, and that legislation is going to go live in April. So we're here to talk about what that means for you in more detail, the information that is contained in the legislation. So as I just mentioned, currently the legislation doesn't allow for any offset of that liability. They could recover the tax and national insurance from an end client business if they'd found that they hadn't demonstrated reasonable care and ultimately come to the wrong IR35 determination. Plus, they're also recovering that amount of tax, national insurance from the contractor when the contractor is filing the accounts at the end of the year. This has resulted in this double taxation element. So the consultation was looking to look at alternatives, and the alternative is this ability to offset. So the new legislation is basically to share the income tax and national insurance liability between the client and the limited company by estimating the offset of national insurance and tax that's already been paid by the worker. One of the things that's come out in the draft legislation is that rather than this now being an estimate of the amount of tax that's being paid, HMRC will work with the client to be able to identify who the contractor was. So, for example, a client has done an assessment of a project manager and they've determined that they were outside IR35, or maybe they've not even done a determination. They just continue to treat that contractor as outside IR35, therefore not accounted for any tax or national insurance. The limited company has done that accounting at the end of the year. HMRC open investigation into that business and deem they haven't demonstrated reasonable care. Delving deeper into the determinations, and then decided that contractor filling that project manager role should have been treated as inside IR35, and the hirer should have been accounted for taxes on a PAYE basis. If that happened, what HMRC will now do is work with the client to identify the tax that contractor's paid. So it does mean there's certain bits of information that will be needed, that the hirer will need to give to HMRC. So this will be the contractor's name, the contractor's company name, contractor company registration number, VAT number, and national insurance number if known, anything that helps identify the tax and the national insurance that contractor is paid. If HMRC are able to see the tax that has been paid, they will offset that against the bill that the client has owed. So the example that's given is this contractor, this project manager that we have has received the equivalent of £50,000 from the client over the course of a year. If that determination was wrong and HMRC was to impose a bill on HMRC, they would be seeking to recover just over £23,000 from the client. However, with the offsetting mechanism that's coming in place in April, if the PSC had paid all the tax that they should have paid on that amount, just over £10,000, that will reduce the client's bill by that £10,000. So in this scenario, the client would only be paying £13,000 to HMRC rather than the £23,000. So a couple of reasons why we've demonstrating this as really important for you as users of independent contractors is we're hoping it doesn't it stops the risk that people aren't using contractors, or they are just saying we'll just treat everyone as PAYE and just pay everyone PAYE and therefore potentially lose talent. We're hoping it will unlock those blanket bans. And also, if people are using tax loss insurances, hopefully it will reduce premiums because the tax at stake is less when the offsetting is available, as we've seen here, it's the £10,000 less just on one contractor. And then this is just another way of showing the scenario that I've just walked through there in terms of, here's a worked example of a contractor on £400 a day, £2,000 a week, and how much tax and national insurance they would pay. So currently, if you as a business say, we're blanket banning all PSCs, we only want to take people on as PAYE through an umbrella company, for example, then if it was an umbrella company, the top scenario is what apply there. So if they're working through an umbrella company and that umbrella company isn't compliant, their umbrella company is using a tax avoidance scheme, the tax and national insurance at risk for the supply chain would be £695 a week. And there is another consultation currently under proposal, a new change in legislation under proposal, where they would be looking to transfer the debt there. So in this case, we're talking about currently that would sit with the umbrella company. If the umbrella company goes bust because and they have been non-compliant, they have been avoiding tax, the debt, that £695 per week, would transfer up the supply chain, back up to the agency or back up to the client, depending on how the supply chain is structured. If businesses start to demonstrate a complete IR35 compliant solution and open the door to considering using contractors and undertaking an IR35 assessment, in the same example that I just talked about there, a contractor on £400 a day, working through their PSC, treated as outside IR35, but HMRC ultimately argued that that was incorrect, my project manager scenario from before, and they were saying they should have been treated as inside IR35, then the tax and national insurance risk in this scenario after the offsetting has taken place is £275 a week. So a significant difference though, which could be over £400 a week in quite a fairly standard rate of pay that we're seeing currently in the market of £400 a day. So in the example that we've highlighted here, the risk of engaging a non-compliant umbrella company as opposed to using a PSC but not quite hitting the threshold required under the legislation and therefore having some liability with HMRC is a difference of £22,000 a year to you as an organisation. So hopefully that's a good example of bringing the proposed legislations and the different consultations we've seen in the industry to life. And we've got a couple of now walking through scenarios of what this means for you. I'll continue to navigate the slides, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague Marcus now, who will take over the webinar.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for that information. Really useful. So hopefully you've got a good understanding from Lauren in terms of those examples of what it means for you as an organisation, what it means for your contractor in the process with this new legislation. We're going to go into a little bit more detail just to cover this off. So what does this actually all mean for you as an organisation? So first of all, the off-payroll offsets. What will that do for you? So ultimately, it will reduce the financial risk associated with the incorrect outside IR35 determinations. Roughly halves it by 15 to 20% of the assignment rate. So what we want to be considering here is, have you got a compliant IR35 solution in place? Has it been assessed correctly? And if not, what would that offset look like for you? So ultimately, as it says there, 15 to 20% would be your offset there. The reduction in blanket bans is something that, as an organisation, Brookson Legal, we've been pushing for a lot of this to be changed in the market. We have identified and we've made our clients aware of the risk of having blanket bans within the organisation. Ultimately, you are not providing your reasonable care obligation by blanket banning. So providing everybody inside of IR35 is as bad as not doing an IR35 assessment in the first place, because you are not demonstrating reasonable care by really understanding what this engagement looks like. So reducing those blanket bans in the market, with many clients being more open to managing the IR35 correctly, is something that we are seeing a big shift in the market at the moment. And I do believe that the industries that are really driven by these blanket bans will start to, I suppose, evolve through the compliant process over time as the legislation comes in. So hopefully for you as a business, it'll allow and unlock that talent opportunity in the market, where you'll be able to get outside IR35 operators. And as you can see, there will be a huge shift in the market. We're likely to see the shift back to PSC from umbrella with these types of changes in legislation in the market. So it's a good opportunity for businesses to really understand where they currently sit, what their processes are, and how can they be ready for 2024 and that legislational change. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, so actions that you really need to consider moving forward, especially with this legislation coming into play in the non too distant future. You really need to consider, do you truly understand and are you aware and educated on how this change would or could affect you as a business? Have you got a compliant process in place for your IR35 assessments? Are they all up to date? Have you made sure that you are demonstrating reasonable care in terms of every 6 to 9 months, reassessing those engagements to make sure that nothing has changed and the engagement, whether it be outside, hasn't fallen inside, or it's an inside and it now pushes to an outside? So please be aware that this is something that you will need to know about. PSLs need to be tightened. So your preferred supplier list will always need to be looked at. They need to be tightened. They need to be prescribed. And they really need to understand the supply chain risk element for your organization. So having that close connection with your suppliers is critical. And it's critical that you, as well as your suppliers, truly understand which part you play in these engagements. Obviously, one of the actions you would need to consider is having an IR35 advisor. Now, that could be somebody who is in-house to your organization, whether that's in-house legal. If not, obviously, Brookson Legal, as ourselves, we advise all of our clients around IR35, their obligations, what their commitments are, and how they can manage their risk and liabilities through the process. So should you require a conversation, we are here as well. And finally, you've got to prepare for the migration from umbrella to PSC. This will be a huge task, and naturally it's going to require change and transformation through your existing processes. And it's important that through that you stay compliant and you understand the risk and liability associated to these changes. Thank you, Lauren. So we're going to talk a little bit briefly around our mock investigation. So briefly, what I'll give you an overview of. There are a number of our clients who have been investigated since the legislation came in April 21. Now, it's really about understanding what your obligations are. I can tell you from a first-hand experience with our clients that HMRC do go into granular detail and they do require a lot of information. So it's always good to be prepared, be ready, and make sure that you are staying compliant throughout the process. So what we do as a law firm, we send Lauren, who you've already seen, into our clients, and she will action as if she is HMRC. So she will investigate you, she will run timelines in terms of gathering information, and she will mimic the process of HMRC so that you really understand the pressure that you would be under from an investigation, but also the leniency will not be there from HMRC. So if they do require information and they give you a date to provide that data by, it's really important that you meet those guidelines. So our mock investigation is based on fictional scenarios dealing with HMRC's investigation. Throughout this process, we've taught our clients the real understanding and the real need for the ability to know their populations of contractors. If they don't, from a hiring manager perspective, understand these populations, it's highly likely that HMRC would lift the lid. Now, IR35 status risk is something that you need to continuously review so that your processes are compliant and they are determined with reasonable care having been taken. What we would do is we would actually evaluate your IR35 status, the outputs of those determinations, to ensure and identify the accurate classifications. Now, what we do usually find, typically with clients that we've not worked with before and we step into to assist, is really understanding what their obligations are for IR35, what their obligations are continuously with IR35 and their contractor population. So for us, it's about really allowing the client to understand the risk that is associated to IR35, as well as the process in managing this continuously. Now, IR35 isn't about having an assessment done at the beginning and moving on. This is a continuously evolving scenario for clients. And what you need to do as a business, you really need to understand that this reasonable care is critical to you as a business. Critical to the point as if you do an IR35 determination and you leave it as that, you are still not demonstrating the full reasonable care requirements, because those contractors should be reassessed throughout their life cycle whilst working in partnership with you as an organization to make sure that that determination at the offset still stands and still stands in terms of whether it's outside or inside. We as an organization, as I mentioned, have done mock investigations for our clients. We've supported our clients through their investigations, and some of the key findings that we've found have been incredible. Now, in our recent study, we found that 4 common trends were the most identified: demonstration of a lack of compliance, knowledge, as well as education, and the ability to demonstrate reasonable care. And I'm sure by now you will probably be saying in your own head, reasonable care, reasonable care, reasonable care. It is for me, and I'm sure Lauren will agree, it's absolutely critical that you continue to think about reasonable care. Every 9 months, think about those reassessments. Make sure, for the sake of 15 minutes of reassessing your population or a contractor, for the sake of 15 minutes, to mitigate liability and risk throughout your profile and throughout your process, is absolutely critical. So here are 4 of the key ones that we have found. Now, you may or may not be aware, and I'm hoping that you are, but it is paramount ultimately that the closest person to the contractor, i.e. the hiring manager, is responsible for doing the assessment, whether that be doing the assessment in partnership with Brookson Legal or your other providers. But ultimately, it's paramount that the correct person is completing this assessment. As you can see, incorrect people completing assessments. So the accountable function completing the IR35 assessment rather than the hiring manager. So what that scenario is saying is you have HR, you have IT, you have finance may be involved. None of them are relevant in the IR35 assessment process. It's the hiring manager. So the closest person to the contractor. If that's not been done, and it was done by HR or recruitment, you will find, if HMRC investigate, that there will be non-compliance through that process being followed. So 1, please be aware that it is critical that the hiring manager is closest to the contractor is completing this IR35 determination. Secondly, multiple tools. You will have all have heard of CEST, and you will have all have had mixed involvement with CEST. I'm sure you will have had some good experiences, some bad experiences, and even some non-determinable experiences with HMRCs. It's really important that you use a supplier, a provider, and you have continuity. At Brookson Legal, we find that when we do engage with some of our clients, they have multiple platforms, multiple services, creating multiple different determination outcomes. And that doesn't help, nor does it create a compliant process for you. So please be aware that CEST and other assessment tools being used in the backup role-based assessments can lead to conflicting outcomes, and it doesn't class as reasonable care because it's not able to reassess those undetermined populations. So again, really understand who your providers are, what their capabilities are as IR35 support to you. And ultimately, something that I would always push is consider subject matter experts. Obviously, Brookson Legal, we're a law firm who specialise in IR35, but there are other people out there that do provide IR35 advice. But try and make sure that you're looking at subject matter experts. Have a look at their tenure and their knowledge of IR35 so they can provide you the right guidance and advice to stay compliant. Another key finding was a lack of understanding of the legislation. Ultimately, insufficient knowledge of legislation from hiring managers or those supporting functions through your business can ultimately result in incorrect answers, which ultimately results in incorrect determinations, incorrect outcomes, creating risk and liability, and financial risk and liability at that as well. So again, please, if you don't work with Brookson or you work with other organizations, don't be afraid of asking them for educational tools, looking for further support. Something that we would always push is re-educating your hiring managers on a cycle every 6, 12, 18 months, maybe, depending how active you are with the contractor population. But refreshers are always critical. You might have a hiring manager who does IR35 assessment, if we say on day 1 of the requirement, but then doesn't need to do another one for 3 years. That person would still need re-educating on the legislation because it evolves throughout its entirety. So again, please be aware of the importance of the knowledge around IR35 and the risk it carries by not being compliant and providing incorrect information. And finally, a role-based assessment versus a contractor-based assessment. Now, absolutely, the legislation states do not approach anybody in the market without an existing determination. So naturally, your roles are going to be your flexible working contracts, your engagements that you're looking to fill are going to be role-based assessments from the start, because you don't have a contractor in the role as the legislation states. And what you need to do is you need to get this through to get a determination on where does this role sit. Now, what we do find is, and again, I'll use Lauren's scenario earlier of project manager. We have a project manager, say Natasha is a project manager, a hirer of project managers, sorry, and she needs 10 project managers. What we can do is we can do a role-based assessment. Absolutely, you can generalize in that scenario, but it's really critical that you also look at the granular detail throughout the process. So if you can group roles together, and that's when you know that the hiring manager, the role, the location of the role, the deliverables of the role, all are exactly the same, then yes, we could look at generalizing that assessment at the offset. Throughout its entirety, it would be worth reassessing those roles with the contractor details in there once you know that that person's in the role. But it's really critical to not generalize too much. HMRC will identify that as risk and ultimately could come after you for incorrect determinations because you haven't demonstrated reasonable care. And again, it's that saying, the reasonable care. It has to be the first thought in your mind when IR35 is knocking on the door. Are we demonstrating reasonable care? Are we providing enough information on these contractors to make sure that we are compliant? It is absolutely critical. So what I would certainly say is, if there is very little that you take from this, take that the importance is reasonable care. Absolutely understanding your population is critical, as well as being educated on the legislation and what that means for you as a business. Thank you, Lauren. So we're at the end of the session now. You can ask questions. I'm sure you will be able to approach us and understand from our perspective how we could support you should that be required. Lauren, is there anything else that you would like to add at all?
Thanks, Marcus. No, I think everything was covered really well. I think obviously we're talking about the offset there and what can happen if HMRC deem that you haven't followed your responsibility under the legislation. The really important bits there in terms of the key findings that we've seen with organisations that Marcus went over, they could stop any investigation anyway into HMRC, and then therefore the offsetting mechanism doesn't even need to be triggered because you've been able to, HMRC have opened a compliance audit into you, you've provided them the information that they've asked you to provide, they're satisfied that you've demonstrated reasonable care, and they close your audit and they move on. You don't even then need to go into the detail of all the individual contractors, how much tax those individual contractors have paid, and therefore anything to do with offsetting your liability, because you've been able to cut it off at the start and you don't have a liability bill because you've been able to get out your war chest of information and say to HMRC, well, this is what we do for IR35. We take our responsibility seriously. Here's all our determinations that we do. We do them at these intervals or whenever there's a change. These are all the education sessions we've done with our managers, our departments. These are the policies, procedures, processes that we have in place. Anything that you can do to demonstrate to HMRC that you are taking your obligations seriously will be another step towards demonstrating your reasonable care. So whilst we started with what these legislation changes are going to be in April and how they should be seen as a welcome change, obviously the idea would be that they'd never even need to be utilised in the first place because you won't have a liability bill. So I think it was a really good recap at the end in terms of how you can stop before HMRC's investigation proceeds any further. But we've put Marcus's contact details on the slide, so if anyone does have any questions, want to discuss anything with us in more detail, then please reach out to Marcus, and we're more than happy to have separate conversations with you in terms of what this means for you individually as a business in your specific scenarios.